Start streaming. Okay, do you guys still have my Twitch channel link?
I think. Let me check.
If not, I can just give it to you again.
Yeah, go ahead and send it again.
Okay. Let's see. Here it is. I'll post in text for voice chat. Oh, one Springleaf already did. Okay, tell me once all of you guys are on there.
Okay.
I'm waiting for your Discord to show up. It's not showing up now. Right. Oh, you've linked. Okay. Or one spring did. Okay, I'm on. Ah, loud fucking ads.
Okay, so what you want to be doing is you want to mute the Twitch and just listen
Yeah.
to me in Discord. Okay. Let me see if I can get this restream chat in case you guys want it. Actually, no, I don't need this. What am I thinking? Okay, and let us begin. So first of all, if you have the project installed, there's a few directories that you want to take note of. Oh yeah, one spring leaf. Just to be sure, do you know what we're doing right now? Okay. What we're doing today is we're creating the structural diagram for the project, the programming architecture. I mean, yeah, pretty much showing you where the code is and giving everybody a better understanding of how Unreal Engine 4 works. Okay. Okay. Let me find those files. Okay. So in general, excuse me. In general, you want to be looking at this glory folder under content, and the places that you want to take into account is player, where you have player character and player controller. And then you also have another location here, which is the mannequin, and these are where all the animations are. And this is the blueprint for the animation. And there's one other location where all the code is at, and this library. Since everybody here is a programmer, you understand that what a library is. It's just where you put all your code references, pretty much. For the stuff that I've worked on for the skills and stats system, I've once again reorganized them into their own folders. But overall, the files that we mainly need to worry about from a programmer's perspective are the animations folder and mannequin, the player character, the player folder here, the library folder, and if you're doing any UI, this UI folder over here. Okay? Everything else you don't have to pretty much worry about. Let me see if there's one other thing. Okay, and this one other file over here is kind of important. But don't worry about it right now because even myself, I'm not exactly sure how to deal with this main game instance at the moment. But I did use it to create the UI, or the switching between the menus and the HUD. But those are pretty much the file locations that you have to be that you have to take a note of where the code is being changed. Okay? Does everybody understand that so far?
Yes.
Okay. Now let's start with where each of the code is. Actually, do you guys want me to start with where all the code is, Or do you want me to start with how do you access code from different parts of the project? One spring leaf, is that a yes for where all the code is, or a yes for how each section is linked to each other?
Section would be preferred.
Okay. So first of all, some quick tips. If you open any blueprint, because we're using the blueprints part of Unreal, we're not using the C++ library. In blueprints, what you're doing is you are just placing nodes down, and these nodes are just functions, right? And so each of these executes a part of code that either you defined or the engine already has, and it does the thing, right? So now,
Yeah.
one of the obvious questions that comes to mind is like, well, how do I access data from other blueprints? You can think of a blueprint as a class pretty much, so how do I access data from other classes? Okay, to do that is pretty easy. First of all, you have to get that other class. So you have to create a function in either this class or the other class that returns the class itself. Okay? And when you create a function, for example, this apply damage function over here, when you click on this purple node, you can add inputs and add outputs, and these can be of any type that you want. Okay? And if you want to return like an entire full blueprint, well, obviously that's a bad idea, because programming wise, you don't want to return something that is that is equal to its original size, right? So does everybody here have experience with C++?
Yes.
No.
Wait, Bob,
Yes, no, and a bit.
wait, who said no?
Bob says no.
Bob
Lee says a
says
bit.
no.
Okay.
Yeah. Bob says no. Leaf is a bit. Me is yes.
Okay, so in C++, when you're accessing data from other classes, you use a reference of that class. The reason why you use a reference is pretty much just a integer of that location of that class in memory. And because C++ has the ability to access memory directly, if you access a reference to a class, then you only access an integer. And because you're only accessing an integer, it saves a lot more space. Okay? And in this case, if you want to create a reference to a class, you can do the same thing. You can just say a new variable. Actually, I'll just use one that already exists. Let's see. Okay, so this last hit target reference, this is a character interaction, and therefore we can access any character interaction values from the last hit reference. This is used, for example, here. Find it. Okay. So the last hit target reference is going to allow us to find which target we want to send the damage to, right? So send damage is a function within last target reference, and therefore if we create a variable that is a character interaction, you can see the object types have this kind of tannish color, and it can be pulled out as an object reference. I'm not exactly sure what these different types mean at the moment, but the one that we want to use is always object reference. Okay? Okay. Now, in the player character class, actually, when we're using classes, sometimes if we get another something else that's a part of another class, for example, if I'm using my spear and I'm hitting my opponent's spear, obviously when I do that, I want to get like the speed of the spear, right? But the speed of the spear is obviously, or in our case, it's in the player character itself. So if I hit another component, it will show me what the other component is, but the other component doesn't have the information I have. So this is one function that's universal in all components of blueprints, like because you can add components, right? So if you get a component, you can always use get owner, and that'll immediately give you the class that owns it, or the object that owns it. Okay? But you can't directly access things over here. You have to always cast this to the class that you want. Are you guys familiar with what casting is?
Yes.
Bob Higgs, One Springleaf, are you guys familiar with that?
A bit.
What about you, One Springleaf? Okay. So what casting is basically it's taking. You can think about it like inheritance, where a child class is similar to a parent's class, but it's not exactly the same. And so sometimes you want to force something to be of one class type, and that's what casting does. Okay? It's a slight oversimplification, but that's functionally what happens, so that's what you're going to be doing most of the time. Now there's another node over here that's very important to use, and that is the isValid node. The reason why isValid is really important is if you're coding in Unreal, or if you're coding in anything, oftentimes you have references to things, right? And oftentimes you will see that if you want to check to see if the reference, if there's something in there, or if it's completely empty. Because if it's completely empty, you can usually use like compare to null, right? And isValid is basically the same thing. You can check to see if an object is valid. In other words, is the object already created in the game already? If it's not, then don't do anything. Otherwise, you get compilation errors that don't really affect the code itself, but they might cause weird bugs later on in the future. Yeah, so isValid can be used to check to see if there's an object already stored in a reference, or to see if an object has already been created yet. Because sometimes, obviously, when the game engine starts, things are generated in a specific order, but we're not exactly sure what that order is. So you always want to check to see if that object or class has been generated yet. This mainly has to do with full blueprint stuff. Okay. Let's see. Is there anything else I want to talk about in terms of flow? Okay. So there's different kinds of references that we use in this project. And let's see if I can find it properly. We have we have an animation reference and a UI reference. Okay? And let me check to make sure there's something here. Okay, actually, we don't have a HUD reference in the player character. Because if you think about it, the player character, even though it says player character, it should be like a character for all classes. And it's also a character that can be used by NPCs. So as a result, the NPC obviously do not have a HUD, right? And because they don't have a HUD, there's no point in giving them a reference to the HUD, because that would conflict later on. But we do have an animation reference, and this animation reference is what you want to be doing if you want to log some key inputs, and then use those key inputs to affect like the animation itself. For example, if you click and drag, and then it stabs and then slashes the spear in that direction, right? That means you have to collect the location of where you clicked and the location where you released, and you have to calculate the angle from that. So For example, something like that is calculated. Give me a moment. Okay. Okay. So as you can see over here, we get the weapon motion direction by taking the release position, subtracting the click bounce position, and then normalizing that vector. Okay, and that gets the direction. This is then used, as you saw before, that's the weapon direction. Where's the weapon direction value? Okay, weapon motion director is over here. And then, as I said before, you go to your mannequin, go to animations, and you go to your player blueprint. And you can see that when I am slashing in combat stance, I'm using this. Oh, actually, sorry. I'm taking the spear stance blend. What this means is the location of the spear in in a spherical graph. I'm not sure if you guys know what a spherical graph is. Do you know what a spherical graph is?
No.
Basically, a
Yeah,
Cartesian graph is x, y, and z, right?
Oh, is this? Oh, okay.
The spherical
That's
graph is like two angles
Oh.
and a radius.
Okay.
Yeah, this is pretty much it. So the spear stance blend is those two angles, because we don't need to worry about the radius because the radius is pretty much constant in our case. Because the spear can't like go longer or shorter, pretty much. And let's see. Yeah. So basically, what happens is that you have that direction, then you update the location of the spear stance blend, or basically where the angular displacement of that spear is in 3D space, and then you take that value and then you immediately read it to get your final animation pose. This is also done onto a blend. What a blend is let's open this for a moment. A blend is pretty much combining multiple animations together. In this case, this is a blend of poses. So this is 50 degrees to the right, 50 degrees to the left, 30 degrees up, 20 degrees down, and it just blends everything through this.
And this is how you did your sort of like swipes.
Yep.
Because yeah, it's just a
then you
blend
can go
of
from any direction to any direction.
yeah.
So that's how both blending and animations get updated. They also get updated based on the state machine that you kind of saw over here. Pretty much you can just drag and then drop a new node. Add state. That's what you do. And in this case, it's basically saying that if the player character reference, if target is in combat stance, then you can enter this transition. That simply means that if you're in this, because you start in this in the beginning, right? Everyone starts here on the entry point. And if this is true, then you go over here. Obviously, as a programmer, once you go there and the transition is complete, you have to turn that off once you go backwards, once you want to go back. And in this case, I've also made another transition to skill. So this is probably what you have not seen yet. And that is, if I go over here, first of all, when I press the mouse button, not only does it move the camera, but it also automatically creates that target lock on the enemy. So here's what it looks like. Obviously, there's some problems because you can't see it now since I'm the first person, but if I switch to the third person toggle, you can see that I'm no longer moving my feet. So I have to recreate the animation blending with this. But as you can see, the spear now automatically slows down when it hits the
The location that the spear can stop is anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Or is it
For example,
specific?
if I go
Okay.
here and I click the mouse again, it'll stop there.
So it's anywhere on the screen the spear can be. It doesn't have to be at those specific 9 points that you keep going to. Yeah, okay, never mind.
Also, if you drag in one direction and you change the direction midway, then you can turn. Right. So this is why I'm saying that it's not a good idea to show this to beginners, because
Yeah.
beginner players are either gonna have way too much fun with this, or they're gonna be so confused. Actually, it's not really that confusing, but it's just really hard to use effectively in combat. So it's better to have preset moves.
So there's 2 controls, one for the spear itself and one for moving the actual point of view, or? Okay.
No, it's like, think about it like in other games where you just have one key combination does one move. Basically, I'm gonna make it so that there's gonna be a menu where you can set, like, let's say you want the spear to start from here. Yeah, and you want to move it all the way here. So in this case, this movement from those 2 locations is considered to be your pre-made move.
Your default swing.
Yeah, your default swing. And that's what you're kind of going to be used to in the beginning as a new player, is that it's going to be just like any other game where you just press one key combination and it does the same thing. But there's later on, you'll find out that there's a menu where you can edit all your moves. Okay? There's also one other feature that I'm not sure if you've seen yet. Basically, you can see that I'm going in the same direction over and over. This is the shift. I think you can see it on the screen. It's a shift left mouse button. And what this does, it allows your swing to always go to the center. Like 0, 0. As you can see, the center is a little bit offset from the bottom. That's because the upper limit is 30 degrees vertically and negative 20 degrees vertically. Okay? And that's an example of how you access variables in other blueprints. Okay? Because if you look in the animation blueprint, I also have a player character reference, and that's why I can get those values that I showed you before. See, the player character reference, and this is a variable, as you can see, spear stance blend. I can just access that variable from there. Okay? Using that and just casting, you can pretty much get from any place to any other place. Oh, there's one more thing that you want to be doing. And let me see if we can find an example. Right here. Okay, so in this case, the other component is a spear mesh, right? Because when you smash against a spear or... Okay, so this other component is not necessarily just the spear. It can also be the mesh of the body. Okay, so it either gets this or this, because all the other ones don't have collision. And so therefore we get owner, and getting owner would then give us the player character, right? And from player character, you can see that I rerouted this down here. We can get the component by class. This means that if you go to a target, if you go to any class, you can also access any of its components. You just have to use this function right here, get component by class, and then choose it from in here. Most likely you have to actually type out the first few letters because there's just so many, because it lists all the components that exist. And then you can get that last hit reference, for example, and then you can access all the information from the enemy player character, for example. Okay? And that's the other thing. If you're going from one, basically this also allows you to go from one component to another component, because obviously, let's say character skills, I'm going to need some values from stats component, right? So I just do get owner. Actually, I think I can actually show this. Let's see. Okay, I do not have it in here. Well, actually, I do right here. So get skill level. So I get the owner of my of self. Self being the character skills component. And since the character skill component is always attached underneath a player character, that means I got the player character, right? And after I get the player character, I can immediately go to get component by class, which is character stats. That means I can now access character stats variables. And in this case, we want to get the skill level stats. And so we go over here and skill level stats, right? I set it to like default 111, right? And this is where you can access those variables as well. Okay. And one other thing is that you might notice with every node you can do a get and a setter. There's a getter and a setter. Pretty self-explanatory. If you have any questions about that, you can ask right now. And let's see. There's one other thing I wanted to show. There's one problem with constantly getting and setting variables, because if you do a set on a structure, on a struct, everybody here knows what a struct is, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so a struct, if you do a set, you can, let's say like this. You can make this, right? And you can set these values. So if on your intuition, you might think that if I only want to set this one thing, then I just drag this out and put a value in there, right? And when you do this, you can also hide the nodes that are not being used to clean it up a little bit. But if you do this, then you make a big mistake. The big mistake is that if you don't put anything into those other pins, then they all get reset to their default values. So you just literally like lose the information. So instead of doing that, what you want to be doing is this. This is set members in battle in okay, so this is set members. If you can see, for
yeah.
every struct you can set just particular values. So let's look at this battle mage skill damage one. So set members in battle mage. Okay, so immediately you just get this reference to the struct. So before, just like we showed before, you just connect this to that. But in this case, now you get to do the opposite, where now you get to click the ones that you want to change. And if you don't, and this time you don't have to like fill in everything. You can only fill in the ones that you checked, pretty much, right? And that sets the value that you want. That's pretty much it. Okay? So let's see. Okay. And that's the overall gist of things, of where each of the code is and how to interact with all the other pieces of code. Okay? Any questions at this point in time?
No, not really.
No, pretty straightforward.
Okay? This is being recorded at the moment, so if you guys forget or want a refresher, you can just like skip through that video and find whatever it is that you need. Because the good thing about YouTube is that it gives us automatic closed captions, right? Okay, and the next thing I want to talk about is how Unreal Engine 4 is structured. Okay? So Unreal Engine 4, the engine itself, it has a lot of different things. If you just right click pretty much in this like file explorer, you can see all the different types of assets that you have. Blueprint classes, you can just think of it as the classic class. The level, pretty self-explanatory. The material is whatever you apply to a surface shape in order to change what it looks like. A particle system, pretty straightforward. But there's a lot more stuff, as you can see. And the overall structure of what Unreal Engine 4 should work is that you have a level that you're playing in. I think an easy way to explain this is using project settings. If you look at project settings and maps and modes, you can see that there's a basic few amount of classes that are that you need to set to even have the project running. One is a default pawn class. Basically, if you create a pawn is basically anything that can be controlled. What is it going to be? In our case, we're going to use the player character blueprint class. What HUD are you going to start out with? Ours is the HUD class. What is the controller that you're using as a player? The player controller. Okay? And these are the main ones I want to be explaining today, because I'm still not exactly sure what GM base does and what this game state, player state, and spectator states are. But I'm pretty clear on what these do. Okay? So Unreal Engine 4 separates data in very particular ways. When you're controlling a character in the game, all the code that's used to control the character should be put in the player controller. Okay? The character class itself, the player character in our case, should have all information about the states of the character. For example, is it currently blocked from using a skill? Is it currently blocked from moving, for example, like if it's CC, right? Is the character currently bleeding? What's the animation that the character is currently on? Or not what animation the character is currently on, but what's the next animation that the character wants to do? For example, like those booleans that I showed you before on whether or not it's doing something, right? So anything that has to do with the state of the character in the game, think about it just like if it was an NPC, then that should all be in the player character class. Obviously, what we're doing currently kind of breaks that, because as you saw before, a lot of the code that we're using that controls the character itself, like the keybinds, is actually in this class, but eventually we're going to have to move that into the player controller class. Okay? We have a HUD class that shows you how the HUD works, and we can just open that really quick to give you guys a general idea of how HUDs work. Okay. So pretty straightforward, right? You have these different nodes. You can set whether or not something is visible. That's why these things don't appear immediately. And some of these can be changed, because you can change the location of the widgets pretty much in real time. So the way you set things in Unreal for UI is that you place the widget onto the screen. Like let's say a name slot right here. You just place it there, and then you open it and access it on the graph over here, and you can access any variables inside there. Usually you cannot access any of the variables here though, because it usually cannot be done. But you can access HUD is not a good example because HUD doesn't have that functionality. But if we look at all menus for a moment, you can see where we can do something unique with this. So for the main menu, everything's pretty straightforward. If we look at the event graph, the main menu is considered to be index widget switcher index 0. Widget switcher just switches between multiple widgets, kind of like tabs in a sense. And if we look at the main menu, on click start button transitioned into another widget, just change the tab on the widget pretty much. And yeah, these events look pretty straightforward to you guys, right? But if we want to do something really special, and for example, I did this for the health augment menu. Okay, let's go there for a moment. Okay, health augments. So basically, I'm not sure if any of you played with the health augments there, but it's actually probably the most have to click on one of these, and then you have to click on one of those to set these. Points assigned gets changed. This happens. And you can't go above 8, so you can't even add more. Because once you add 1, then it gets starts at level 1, right? So that blocks you. Click on these to clear, and everything works. You cannot do anything over here because it's selected. All the logic is there. Okay, so as you saw over here, there was like 5 of these, right? But they weren't generated in the UI. So how did I do that? So basically what I did here was I made it so that I created a see, where is that for a moment? Class menu. Edit loadout. Okay. Alright, here. Initialize health augment. So basically I created a custom event that gets triggered as soon as you start the game. And what happens is that obviously make sure the character is loaded, but once the character is loaded, it gets the character stats, it gets the health augment stats from the character stats component, and then for each of those health augment bar augments, because these are empty in the beginning, it creates a spin box with an item description. And when it does this, the spin box with icon and description is over here. It's another widget that I made, pretty much. It looks like this. So then you can do what you expect with programming and just draw that onto the screen inside of a vertical box. Okay? And there you go. And that's how you can dynamically kind of update your widgets in a sense.
Someone joined your Twitch chat.
Someone entered. Okay. Let me check. There. Well, hello, Squacktastic. Welcome. Let's see. Okay, what was I talking about? Oh yeah. The difference between player character and player controller. So player controller, I have very few functionality. I just have menu switching over here because this is something that only the player should be able to access, and so that's why the player controller is able to change between menus, but obviously the an AI one would not be. And then there's this show menus function. So before, remember I said how like the main game instance is a class that I'm still not sure how it works. So basically every time the game runs, what happens is that there's a main game instance that gets generated that's going to be alive, aka like it's going to be the only object that exists throughout the entire time the game is being played. As in, like, not only when you press the play button, but as soon as when the program starts running. So this is available all the time, and therefore you can put whatever functionality you want in there that would require you to always, that would require the game to always be running. Okay. There's very few cases where that's the case, so most of the time this should be very small. But if we look at this, this is the main functionality that I have in the main game instance. It's just these two events that allow you to switch between the main menu and the HUD. If you think about this, this makes sense because even though right now when you start the game you're already inside the level, but normally when you start the game you're not inside the initial the battle arena level. You're usually in a menu level, right? So as a result, you have to use some way to switch between when you use the UI and when you use the HUD. Obviously, or no, when you use the menus and when you use the HUD, because the menus only appear especially if you have multiple types of menus, for example, like in-game menus versus main menu menus. So the main menus basically are just shown using show menus event. This also has to keep track of things, for example, like whether or not you show the mouse cursor, because obviously when you're in game with the HUD does not have a mouse cursor, but menus do have mouse cursors. So that's also taken into account here. And in this case, once again, we're using this is valid, so we don't have to create this thing every single time. We just create it once, and then if it's already valid, we just use what's already there. And that's what we set it over here. And we run this show HUD function whenever we want to, when we're inside a fight, pretty much. Okay? So that's an example of how that works. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So the player controller should be handling player input, but it's also okay to put that in player class temporarily. Some people on the Unreal Answers website have also said that there's a lot of people who just put like the code for key input inside player characters as well. So that's apparently fine. But but I think I'm gonna try to eventually split that up into player and player controller, because I'm gonna have an AI controller later. Okay. There's another thing called a level blueprint. Pretty much, if you look at the level that we have right here, and you say blueprint, open level blueprint, it's a weird way of accessing it, but this is how you access it. This is where you can put code for like that level itself. This is especially useful if you have like level design and you have certain elements that interact with your character in that level in very specific circumstances, in only that level itself. Then you want to put the code in here. This is also where you can spawn the background music for that level. And this is where that the sound comes in for this the recollection music that Paul made. Set as a reference here, and it just gets played. Okay, where else can you put data? You can put data and you can put functions in game mode as well, but I'm not sure what game mode does at the moment. It's still a bit unclear to me. But I do know that the main places where you can put just generic functionality is the player controller, the player character, the main game instance, and the blueprint level. Because all of those can access all pretty much any data that you want. I think all of those classes have access to the most amount of variables. If you were to go into here and just right click and just try to find a variable, these are the 4 classes that have access to the most of them. Because obviously an animation blueprint and a HUD UI blueprint or a widget blueprint is very much more specialized, so they don't have access to all the variables that you might be looking for. Okay, and let's see. Blueprints can also be used to edit the combinations of different materials in order to create a more advanced material, but that's a little bit outside of my scope of expertise, so I won't be going over that. Okay, is there anything else? I've covered animation, I've covered UI, I've covered the player character, the skill system, the health augments, the stats. Okay, there's one other thing that I want to show you guys. We have one other thing here that's kind of special, and this is the code that Jordy left us with, which is really neat. I'm still not exactly sure how everything works yet, but for the most part, I know how to at least use it. So you guys might be wondering, how is it that we're collecting all of this, all the keybinds, and how is it that we are setting them? Well, not how are we setting them? how are we setting them, and how are we acting on them, pretty much, right? So the way we do this is there's this special function right here. So this is a thing that executes on server, and as a result, I think there might be some server functionality in here already. For this is especially for you, OneSpringLeaf. So this might be something that you want to take a note of later on. Okay. And what happens is that I'm not exactly sure what this call bind trigger means, but when you execute a bind, then or whenever this event fires, then it releases an action. An action is a name. A name is just a string that has no spaces, pretty much. Okay? And that's why all the results you can see here are just kind of like camel case, but like the first letter is also capitalized. And so where are all these user binds? These user binds are stored in this array over here. Pretty much, if you want to create a new user bind, you can just put it input pattern. So in this case, Shift E and then do nothing, while on the ground means interact. And let me find an example of one that's currently being used. Lock on. Okay. So if I play the game and I press the middle mouse button, if you look at the debug messages that are appearing in the top left, you can see that I pressed the middle mouse button, and then it said, if it was really quick, actually I'll do it multiple times so you can see it. So it says middle mouse button, and then middle mouse button R. What that means is middle mouse button R means that it released the middle mouse button. And just middle mouse button by itself means that you click. Okay?
Okay.
And this is also shown with this UI widget that Jordy made. This is accessed through the / button. And you can see that the green one is the middle mouse button. Actually, wait. Check. Okay, so green should be the first one, where you pressed it, and the yellow should be the one where you pressed it. Okay, and yeah, one thing I forgot to show is like once you're in lockdown mode, that's the small way to fix. But once you're over here, you can also still do skills, right? That's what that execution line was for earlier. So basically, you can put these patterns, as you can see over here, middle mouse button, on release, it locks you on. Okay, and we just add one over here, and then for each case it creates this bind target variable, and that's why the action is a bind target, and the bind target is what you have to match with a boolean in order to just do each of these functions, or the functionality, to implement the functionality for each of these inputs. So this is a very clear way of showing you what's going on. Okay. Let's see. I think I'll show you guys one more thing, and this is something that I'm currently working on with the collision of the spear, and is that we have line traces, or ray casting, pretty much. You can think of it as not the really fancy ray casting of like graphics wise, but ray casting for seeing if you detect something you need to interact with. Ray casting. So this is a sphere trace for objects, and we are looking for weapon type objects, because if you look over here, the spear mesh, we go to collision, and you can see that this is an object type weapon. Okay? And what happens is that every time the weapon overlaps another weapon or a player, it generates an overlap event. And this is why we can only find overlaps. This on component begin overlap will only trigger on meshes and spear meshes, because the mesh, as you can see, is an object type player that I've set. Okay, and in this case, whenever this happens, a sphere trace will like if the spear hits another spear, then it will make a ray trace from the location of where the spear is, basically where the spear's this is the socket location of the spear on the player character. So starting from where the hand is gripping the spear, all the way to the length of the spear in the direction of the spear itself. Up vector times negative 240. 240 is because 240 centimeters is 2.4 meters. And negative because if you look over here, look at the spear. Up is in the z direction. So if you look at the z direction itself, that is going the opposite way. So that's why we need a negative value. So you add upon that, get the tip. And therefore you trace a sphere. Where was I? So you start from this location to this location, you create a sphere of radius 10 units, basically a tenth of a meter, or 10 centimeters. And you check to see if there's any weapons. If there was a weapon, then you get the out hit. And if you break this, you can find the location of that hit. And this is going to be used for whatever you want. There's also, if you look here, trace. Okay, so you can see over here you get line traces, you get capsule traces, box traces, multiple box, sphere, line, capsule, and those are different kind of traces that you can do. Okay, now what does this look like? Now you can see it if I go over here. Once the hit occurs, anything that's past that location becomes green. And if you look carefully, you can see a red dot that shows you where the hit location happened. So that's a miss because I'm hitting the bottom part. So it's a little bit difficult to work with, but in the majority of cases it will detect the hit. As you can see, the red cubes that you kind of see, or the red squares that you see, are the locations of the actual hit. And that's pretty much how traces work. These are especially useful if you want to detect if certain things are happening in your level. And that's pretty much it, I think. Oh yeah, there's also one more thing is, like I said before, there's components for stats and skills. The stats component also keeps track of all your buffs, because obviously your buffs are applied and removed on stats. The CC, on the other hand, is actually in the player character class itself, because it affects the state. And that's why all this stuff is over here. And that's also why if you look at crowd control, you can see variables for the current active CCs and the current time and previous time. Okay? And this is why there's this function over here, get skill effects. It's only partially working right now because it only gets the skill damage. But if you have skill CC, I'm later going to add skill CC and buffs, skill buff, and then you can just literally send damage, because you're functioning over here, excuse me, where when on damage happens, then it just applies damage. And if on buff, when you're buffed, when this on buff event happens, then you activate, you add your buff and you update the stats. And if you get CC, then you apply the CC pretty much. Yep. And later on, there's going to be 2 more nodes over here at the end, and that's going to be it. And I think that's all I can think of at the moment for how Unreal Engine 4 works. There's still a few things I don't know, like I'm not sure what these are, because these are all from what Jordy was using. Gun offset is something that's, I think, dragged over from the first person character that's holding the gun. Yeah. But we're keeping it because obviously we have gun classes, right? A lot of these other variables I'm not exactly sure on, especially these ones that Jordy made. But overall, I think that's pretty much it. Do you guys have any questions? No questions?
Well,
Okay. And now we can quickly go on to here and create the, put this over here. So we have this content folder. Oh my god. Content folder, and underneath here we have okay, how do I do this again? What kind of connector was this? I think it was this curve thing. Huh. Give me a moment. Okay. I think it was something like this. Oh yeah. Ah, here we go. It's this vertical elbow. Now I remember what's going on. Okay, so from that content folder, if I remember correctly, we have the library folder, the player folder. Okay. Okay, we have the player folder. Wait, what? We have this, and player, and then mannequin. Actually, wait a moment. Ah, this is glory. Let's drag everything down. Okay, so in the glory folder we have the library, the player, and the UI. Okay. And here we have the animations. Okay. Have one over here. Okay. And this is the content folder. Okay, what shape should we use? Or just hexagon? And over here we have skills. And enums. Okay, that's pretty much it. Under player we have player character and player controller. Okay, let's see. Okay. And here we have main game instance. I missing anything? Oh, the UI. Okay. I think that is pretty much everything. Oh, one more over here for the animation blueprint. Okay, is there anything else here? We have the UI stuff, we got the player character stuff, the library. Yep, that seems like it's pretty much it. Okay.
Okay.
Do you guys have any more questions before
No, I
we
got
stop
nothing.
this stream?
I got nothing.
One Springleaf Tipper, you have any questions?
No, it's all good.
Okay. And I'm going to stop streaming and stop recording.